All right, so we've gotten a lot of requests to cover Plessy v. Ferguson.
Yeah, one of the big landmark Supreme Court cases.
Absolutely, and it really set the stage for America's struggle with racial equality.
Right.
So we're going all the way back to the 1890s to New Orleans,
Oh, yeah, you
the
looked at.
city that was really buzzing with life, but also grappling with some serious tensions.
It was a fascinating time, right? You have all this stuff going on. Picture New Orleans as this melting pot, but just beneath the surface, there's all this simmering tension.
Oh, yeah.
You have Jim Crow laws taking hold, designed to just systematically separate Black Americans from white society, and it's really a direct backlash against all the progress that was made during Reconstruction.
Right, and for those who might not remember Reconstruction, that was the period after the Civil War when the nation was trying to reintegrate the South and guarantee rights for formerly enslaved people. And so, Reconstruction, I mean, it had these noble goals,
Hmm.
like granting citizenship and voting rights to Black people.
Hmm.
But, ultimately it fell short.
Yeah.
And as a result, these Jim Crow laws started cropping up everywhere.
Absolutely, and they found ways, right, to circumvent all the things that were supposed to guarantee equality. I mean, think about it, right? We have the 13th Amendment abolished slavery.
Yeah.
14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment was aimed at guaranteeing voting rights. But despite all that, Southern states found ways around it, and Jim Crow laws became their weapon of choice.
The loophole. Yeah, and so it's in this environment that we meet Louis Martinet, a newspaper editor who was not about to let injustice stand. His paper, The Crusader, was known for its strong stance against discrimination.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Martinet, he had witnessed firsthand the broken promises of Reconstruction.
Right.
And he understood the power of the press and the law. And he decided to use both to challenge the Separate Car Act, which was a particularly insidious law that mandated segregated train cars.
Yeah.
So you couldn't ride in the same train car if you were Black or white.
It wasn't just a random decision, though, was it? I mean, it sounds like there was a very deliberate strategy behind this challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. So Martinet, along with a group of like-minded individuals, they formed the Citizens Committee to test the constitutionality of the separate car law. And they wanted to meticulously construct a test case that would just expose the absurdity of the law and force the courts to address it head on.
Wow.
Like they thought this through really carefully.
And that's where Homer Plessy enters the picture. This wasn't just some guy who happened to sit in the wrong train car.
No, not at all. Plessy was a shoemaker of mixed racial heritage, and they chose him very, very carefully because his light skin tone really underscored the arbitrariness of racial classifications.
Oh.
It was this brilliant tactic to just illustrate the absurdity of trying to legally define who was Black and who was white. Where do you draw the line?
So they had this plan in place, they had their champion, and then came that fateful train ride.
Yes. So on June 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy boarded a train car that was designated for white passengers in New Orleans.
Okay.
He informed the conductor of his heritage, knowing full well what the reaction would be.
Right.
And as expected, Plessy was asked to move to the colored car. He refused, and right on cue, a prearranged detective arrested him. This was the spark that they needed to ignite their legal battle.
Talk about meticulous planning. They anticipated every single step. They knew they wanted to take this all the way to the Supreme Court?
Absolutely, yeah. They understood that the path to justice wasn't going to be easy. They knew they would face roadblocks, and they were prepared for the long haul. Their plan was to fight this case all the way to the highest court in the land.
And so the case begins its journey through the legal system. Starts in a New Orleans court, but quickly faces a hurdle.
Yeah, so the initial judge, he dismissed the case, arguing that interstate travel was under federal jurisdiction, not state.
Okay.
However, Plessy had also boarded a train within Louisiana, a detail planned for by Martinet and the Citizens Committee.
Wow.
And that aspect of the case, overseen by Judge John Ferguson, proceeded to trial.
It seems like they were ready for every single curveball thrown their way.
They were really thinking ahead. But their foresight didn't change the outcome of that first round.
Right.
Judge Ferguson, as they anticipated, ruled against Plessy and upheld the Separate Car Act. Now, this was a setback, but not unexpected. Their strategy was built on appealing this decision, hoping to ultimately get it before the Supreme Court.
Okay.
So, lose the battle, win the war kind of thing.
This case wasn't just about Plessy or even segregated train cars. This was about challenging the very foundation of segregation, was it?
Yeah, precisely. They knew that if they could get the Supreme Court to overturn the Separate Car Act, it would set a precedent that could unravel other Jim Crow laws across the South. So this was about the big picture, the fight for equality itself.
So they needed someone who could argue this case with the eloquence and legal acumen it deserved.
Oh yeah, they needed a heavy hitter.
Enter Albion Tourget. Now here's a fascinating character. A novelist, a former Union soldier, and a fierce advocate for civil rights who even had a history battling the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, he's like a real-life superhero. Tourget was a staunch abolitionist and a firm believer in racial equality. And he saw this case as a pivotal moment in history. He was deeply troubled by, the rollback of Reconstruction-era progress, particularly the emergence of Jim Crow laws. And, for him, this case was a chance to really challenge the very heart of a system that was designed to subjugate Black Americans.
He must have known this was a long shot, though, given the political climate of the time.
He did. But Tourget was undeterred. He believed in the power of the law, particularly the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and saw this case as an opportunity to use that clause as a shield against, this rising tide of discrimination.
So he was essentially arguing that by enforcing segregation, Louisiana was violating the very principles of equality that were enshrined in the Constitution. It was a bold argument, especially given the makeup of the Supreme Court at the time.
Absolutely. To convince the court, Tourget had to craft a strategy that would appeal to their legal understanding while also addressing, the moral complexities of the issue.
So what was his game plan? What were the key arguments he used to try and sway the justices?
Well, he brilliantly attacked the very notion of racial classifications. He argued that assigning race was inherently subjective and nonsensical. And remember, Plessy's mixed heritage was a key element here. Tourget used this to illustrate the absurdity of the law. If race was truly a defining characteristic, where would the line be drawn?
It seems like he was forcing them to confront the inconsistency and arbitrariness of their own logic.
Exactly. He's like, you guys are being ridiculous. But Tourget went even further. He cleverly framed the argument in terms of property rights, a language that the court was very familiar with.
Yeah.
And he argued that a person's reputation, their ability to be perceived as white, had tangible value in a society where whiteness granted privileges and opportunities. So denying someone the right to that reputation was akin to depriving them of property.
That's incredibly insightful. He was essentially saying that denying someone access to the privileges associated with whiteness was a form of economic and social harm. It was a brilliant legal tactic.
It was really clever. He was appealing to their sense of fairness, but also to their understanding of, established legal principles.
Right.
It was a very calculated move given the court's conservative leanings.
So he laid out this meticulously crafted legal argument. But did he also appeal to their sense of morality? Did he address the broader implications of upholding the Separate Car Act?
Oh, absolutely. He didn't shy away from the moral implications at all. He warned the court about the dangerous precedent they would set if they ruled against Plessy. He argued that if Louisiana could legally segregate its citizens, what was to stop other states from doing the same?
Right.
And he painted this grim picture of a future where legal discrimination could permeate every aspect of American life.
His arguments sound eerily prophetic, considering what happened in the decades following the Plessy decision. He was essentially foreshadowing the rise of Jim Crow laws that would further entrench segregation and inequality throughout the nation.
Yeah, it's like he could see into the future. He understood the potential ramifications. If the court ruled against Plessy, it would embolden racist attitudes and practices, leading to just this cascade of discriminatory laws and policies that would take decades to dismantle.
So the stage was set. They had their champion, their arguments prepared.
Yeah.
And a nation on edge waiting for the Supreme Court's decision.
I mean, you can just imagine, right? The courtroom must have been so thick with anticipation. It's just 3 decades after the Civil War, and the nation is still deeply divided on this issue of race.
Of course.
And the outcome of this case, it was going to determine the courts of race relations in America for generations to come.
It's almost unimaginable the weight of history resting on the shoulders of these justices.
I mean, did anyone really believe that Plessy had a chance given the prevailing attitudes of the time?
I mean, there was hope, right? Fueled by, the strength of Tourget's arguments and just this belief in the promise of equality.
Right.
But realistically, the odds were stacked against them. The Supreme Court at that time was not known for its progressive stance on racial matters.
Right.
I mean, they were pretty conservative.
And then the decision came down, a devastating 7-1 ruling in favor of Louisiana. The separate but equal doctrine was now the law of the land. It's hard to fathom the impact this must have had on Black communities across the country. It was a crushing blow. All that hope that had been building, the anticipation just dashed in an instant. The court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, it was just a profound setback for racial equality. Essentially, what they were saying was that states could legally segregate every aspect of public life.
It's almost as if the court was saying that separate could indeed be equal,
Yeah.
despite the obvious inequalities that existed in every facet of society.
Mhm.
Were they blind to the reality on the ground?
I think so. They acknowledged the potential for inequality, but claimed that if facilities were equal in quality, then separation didn't violate the 14th Amendment, which of course is a bunch of, baloney, because separate almost always meant inferior for Black Americans. I mean, schools, hospitals, parks, even cemeteries, everything was segregated.
Yeah.
And Black facilities, they were chronically underfunded and neglected.
So this decision wasn't just about separate train cars. It was about creating a system where Black people were relegated to second-class citizenship, denied opportunities, and systematically disadvantaged in virtually every sphere of life.
Exactly. The Plessy ruling had a ripple effect, and it emboldened those who sought to maintain white supremacy. I mean, it just opened the floodgates for just this avalanche of discriminatory laws across the South. So, poll taxes, literacy tests were implemented to disenfranchise Black voters. Lynchings and racial violence escalated with little to no legal recourse for the victims.
Wow.
And the separate but equal doctrine just became the shield for those who wanted to perpetuate a system of racial hierarchy.
And it wasn't just confined to the South, was it? Did the Plessy decision have consequences for Black communities beyond the former Confederate states?
Oh, absolutely. While Jim Crow was most blatant in the South, the Plessy decision had a national impact. It legitimized segregationist thinking and practices, all across the country. In the North, discrimination was often less overt, but it was still pervasive, impacting housing, education, employment. So the separate but equal doctrine cast a long shadow over the entire nation.
Amidst this really disheartening reality, there's one element of the Plessy decision that stands out, and that's Justice John Marshall. Harlan's powerful dissenting opinion. He was the lone voice of reason on the court, wasn't he?
He was. Harlan's dissent it's a remarkable document. Just a beacon of moral clarity in a sea of injustice. I mean, he just eviscerated the majority opinion, arguing, the Constitution is colorblind and that separate but equal was just a sham designed to maintain white supremacy.
He wasn't just disagreeing with the majority. He was calling out their hypocrisy and the devastating consequences of their decision.
Totally. He was like, you guys are going to regret this. And, he warned that the Plessy ruling would become as infamous as the Dred Scott decision, which had denied citizenship to Black people just a few decades prior.
Right.
And he predicted that it would sow discord and racial strife for generations to come.
Which it did.
And tragically, his words proved prophetic.
It's really a testament to his foresight and his unwavering belief in the principle of equality. Did Harlan's dissent have any immediate impact, or was it simply a lone voice crying out in the wilderness?
At the time, it was largely ignored.
Right.
However, his words would later become a source of inspiration for civil rights activists. A reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, there were those who recognized the inherent evil of segregation.
So we have this landmark decision, a legal framework for segregation, and a lone voice of dissent. What happens next? How does the Plessy decision shape the landscape of America in the years that follow?
Well, the aftermath of Plessy was a period of profound darkness for Black Americans, emboldened by the Supreme Court's endorsement of segregation. Southern states, they just intensified their efforts to disenfranchise and marginalize Black communities. Jim Crow laws became even more pervasive. Racial violence escalated.
It's a stark reminder that legal victories don't always translate to social progress. The law can be a tool for both oppression and liberation, can it?
Right. It absolutely can. The Plessy decision demonstrates that the law without a moral compass can be manipulated to serve the interests of those in power. It highlights the importance of constantly scrutinizing legal precedent and challenging those laws that contradict our fundamental values.
So while the Plessy ruling was a major setback,
Yeah.
the fight for equality didn't end there. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in this very soil of oppression, weren't they?
Absolutely. Despite the immense challenges they faced, Black communities refused to be silenced or marginalized. They organized, they built institutions, and cultivated a spirit of resistance that would eventually blossom into a full-fledged movement for social change.
So even in the face of such adversity, there were glimmers of hope,
Yeah.
signs that the spirit of equality wouldn't be extinguished.
Exactly. Leaders and activists like W.E.B. Du Bois emerged challenging the status quo and demanding, full citizenship rights for Black Americans.
Right.
Organizations like the Niagara Movement and later the NAACP were formed, laying the groundwork for the legal battles and social movements that would ultimately dismantle Jim Crow.
They took the legacy of Plessy and turned it into fuel for the long and arduous struggle for equality. It's an incredible testament to their resilience and determination.
It really is. The fight for equality was far from over. Plessy may have been a setback, but it also ignited a fire in the hearts of those who believed in a more just and equitable America. It set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the dismantling of Jim Crow and the eventual triumph of the civil rights movement.
It's a reminder that the arc of history bends toward justice, even if the path is long and winding. But what about the legacy of Plessy today? How do you think this case decided over a century ago continues to shape contemporary America?
It's amazing, isn't it, how a case about something like train cars could have such a lasting impact on American society?
It really is. What do you think is the most crucial takeaway from Plessy for our listeners?
I think Plessy really just underscores the power of the law to both uphold and dismantle systems of oppression. It's a stark reminder that legal precedent doesn't always equal justice.
Right.
And it serves as this call to action, urging us to constantly question the laws that govern our society and fight for those that, truly reflect our values of equality and fairness.
So it's about recognizing that, the fight for justice is an ongoing process.
Right.
We can't just assume that because a law exists, it's inherently just or equitable.
Absolutely not. We have to remain vigilant and continue to challenge laws and systems that perpetuate inequality, even if they've been in place for decades or even centuries. The Plessy case is a perfect example of how legal precedent can be overturned when enough people stand up and say, this is wrong.
It also highlights the importance of individual acts of courage. Homer Plessy, Louis Martinet, Albion Tourget, they all knew the risks they were taking, yet they chose to fight for what they believed in.
Yeah, their willingness to challenge the status quo, to put themselves on the line for a greater cause, it's truly inspiring. They remind us that change often begins with the actions of ordinary individuals who refuse to accept injustice.
And let's not forget Justice Harlan's powerful dissent. He stood alone, but his words would eventually echo through the decades, inspiring future generations to challenge the legacy of Plessy.
That's right. Harlan's dissent is a testament to the power of principled opposition, even when you're facing overwhelming odds. His words remind us that speaking truth to power, even when it seems futile, can plant the seeds for future change.
Plessy might have been a dark chapter in American history, but it also illuminated the path toward a brighter future. A future where separate but equal is nothing but a distant memory.
So, for our listeners, what are some of the lingering effects of Plessy that we still see today? Even though segregation is no longer legally sanctioned, how does this case continue to shape contemporary America? That's a great question. And, while we've made significant progress since Plessy, the legacy of segregation, it continues to cast a long shadow. We still grapple with systemic inequalities in areas like education, healthcare, housing, and the criminal justice system, all areas that were deeply affected by decades of legally enforced segregation.
So we're still grappling with the consequences of those separate but equal train cars, even though they no longer exist.
Exactly. The Plessy decision created a system that systematically disadvantaged Black Americans, and the effects of that system are still felt today. It's a reminder that dismantling legal barriers is only the first step. We also have to address the deep-rooted social and economic disparities that continue to plague our nation.
What lessons can we learn from this historical turning point to help us build a better future? What should our listeners take away from this deep dive into Plessy v. Ferguson?
I think Plessy teaches us the importance of understanding our history, both its triumphs and its failures. It reminds us that the law can be a double-edged sword, a tool for both oppression and liberation. And perhaps most importantly, it inspires us to never stop fighting for a more just and equitable world.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing process, one that requires constant vigilance and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
And for anyone listening who wants to delve deeper into this pivotal case, I highly recommend the book We as Freemen, Plessy v. Ferguson by Keith Weldon Medley. It gives a really fascinating look at the personal stories and legal battles that shaped this landmark case.
And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Plessy v. Ferguson. It's a story that continues to resonate today, urging us to confront the legacies of injustice and strive for a society where equality is not just a promise, but a reality. Thanks for joining us.